The heavy wooden doors of the Austin courthouse groaned on their hinges as they swung shut. The courtroom was a patchwork of worn wood and muted whispers, the air laden with the faint scent of varnish and dust. The creak of the jury's benches mingled with the murmurs of the spectators, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding at the front of the room. Seated high on his bench, Judge Roy Bennett surveyed the defendant before him with an expression of amused disdain. His silver hair glinted under the fluorescent lights, and his sharp, angular features were set in a smirk. Known for his cutting remarks and a reputation for harsh judgments, Judge Bennett was in his element. Today's target, an 18-year-old black girl named Layla Harris, who stood accused of stealing a luxury watch from a local jeweler. Layla stood at the defendant's table, her shoulders square despite the weight of the accusations. Her caramel-brown skin was smooth, her dark eyes steady and unwavering. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, her only accessory a single braided bracelet on her wrist. Though her posture betrayed a hint of nervousness, there was something unyielding in her gaze, a quiet, almost defiant confidence that seemed out of place for someone in her position. "Well, Miss Harris," Judge Bennett began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you seem awfully calm for someone facing serious charges. Don't tell me you've been binge-watching lawyer dramas and think you can argue your way out of this." The courtroom tittered with low laughter, and Layla's court-appointed attorney, a disheveled man in his 40s named Martin Crane, winced slightly. Layla, however, didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze locking onto the judge's. "I wouldn't say that, Your Honor," she replied evenly. Her voice was soft but carried an undercurrent of steel. "But I do believe in the presumption of innocence. Isn't that the foundation of our legal system?" The judge's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, broader than before. "Ah, a scholar are we?" he sneered. "Tell me, Miss Harris, did you memorize that line before or after you walked out of that jewelry store with a watch worth more than your monthly rent?" A murmur swept through the spectators, a mix of curiosity and disdain. The case had drawn attention, not because of the crime itself but because of the players involved. Layla, a quiet girl from a working-class neighborhood, seemed like an unlikely suspect. Yet here she was, accused by a prominent jewelry store manager and backed by grainy surveillance footage that allegedly showed her pocketing the watch. Layla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers steady. "After, Your Honor," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. "If I'd done what you're suggesting, that is." The judge's eyes narrowed, and his smirk turned into a thin-lipped smile. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "Careful, Miss Harris. Sarcasm won't win you any points in this courtroom." Martin Crane shifted uncomfortably beside her, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "if we could focus on the evidence." "Oh, I intend to," Bennett interrupted smoothly. He turned his gaze to the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Linda Chavez. "Let's hear what evidence the state has gathered to support these, shall we say, fascinating allegations." Linda rose with the confidence of someone who had won more cases than she could count. "Your Honor, we have the testimony of the store manager, Mr. Richard Lane, who personally witnessed the defendant take the watch. Additionally, we have security camera footage that corroborates his account." The judge gestured for her to continue, his smirk returning as he glanced at Layla. "Go on." Linda clicked a remote, and the screen at the front of the courtroom lit up with grainy black and white footage. The video showed a young woman who resembled Layla browsing the watch display. The quality was poor, pixelated, and out of focus, but the figure's movements were deliberate. A flash of her hand reaching toward the display was visible, followed by the outline of an object being tucked into her pocket. The spectators whispered among themselves, the sound a low hum beneath the creaking of the wooden benches. Layla's expression remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the screen. "And there you have it," Linda concluded, pausing the video. "The defendant was the last person near the display before the watch was discovered missing. Coupled with Mr. Lane's testimony, this establishes a clear chain of events." Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Well, Miss Harris, it doesn't look good for you, does it? If I were in your shoes, which thankfully I'm not, I'd be sweating right about now." Layla finally broke her silence, her voice steady and deliberate. "If you were in my shoes, Your Honor, you'd be wondering why the footage is too blurry to clearly identify me, and why the store manager's statement conveniently leaves out details." The courtroom fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Even Martin looked taken aback, as if seeing his client in a new light. Judge Bennett's smirk twisted into a scowl. "Are you suggesting that the state's evidence is faulty, Miss Harris?" "I'm suggesting," Layla replied, her tone cool and measured, "that the evidence should be examined more closely before assumptions are made." The judge chuckled, a low, sardonic sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts won't save you here." Layla didn't respond, her expression unreadable. She simply folded her hands on the table and waited. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Bennett's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Who was this girl, and why did she seem so unshaken by the judge's taunts? The spectators leaned forward in their seats, their curiosity piqued. Layla's calm defiance was a mystery they couldn't yet unravel. The judge's gavel struck sharply, silencing the murmurs that had rippled through the courtroom following Layla's quiet but cutting response. Judge Roy Bennett leaned forward on his bench, his smirk replaced by an edge of irritation. "Miss Harris," he drawled, "you may think you're clever, but cleverness and legal arguments aren't the same thing. Why don't you leave the law to the professionals and focus on explaining yourself?" Layla's eyes didn't waver, though a small, cryptic smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The spectators watched her in a mix of curiosity and disbelief. She wasn't defiant or disrespectful. Her calm composure was more unnerving than outright rebellion. It was as if she was privy to a bigger picture, one no one else in the room could see. "Your Honor," Layla said slowly, her voice steady, "I'm simply pointing out the facts. Isn't that what we're here to do?" Judge Bennett's knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped the edge of his bench. "No, Miss Harris. We're here to determine whether or not you're guilty. And right now, the evidence doesn't seem to be in your favor." The prosecutor, Linda Chavez, stood to redirect the attention back to her case. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mr. Richard Lane, the manager of Lux Jewels, to the stand." Richard Lane, a tall, lean man in his early 50s with a sharp suit and a carefully practiced air of authority, approached the stand. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his expression was one of cool confidence. After swearing in, he adjusted his tie and cast a fleeting glance at Layla before addressing the court. "Mr. Lane," Linda began, "can you recount the events of the day in question?" Lane cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "Of course. Miss Harris entered the store in the afternoon, around 2:30 p.m. She spent a considerable amount of time at the watch display, which immediately raised my suspicion. She seemed hesitant, as though she was waiting for something. "Did you approach her?" Linda asked. "I did," Lane replied, nodding. "I asked if she needed assistance, and she said she was just browsing, but her demeanor was off nervous." "And then what happened?" "She moved closer to the most expensive watches. A minute later, one of our top-tier pieces, a $12,000 timepiece, was missing from the display. I immediately checked the security footage, and it was clear that she had taken it." Linda nodded and gestured to the paused footage still displayed on the screen. "This is the footage you reviewed?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, Mr. Lane," Linda concluded, turning back to Judge Bennett. "Your Honor, this eyewitness account, combined with the surveillance footage, clearly establishes the defendant's guilt." As Lane stepped down, Martin Crane hesitated before rising for cross-examination. He adjusted his glasses, his movements awkward and unconvincing. "Mr. Lane," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "isn't it possible that the watch was misplaced or taken by another customer?" Lane chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not a chance. I run a tight operation. Everything is accounted for." Martin pressed on, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence. And this footage, do you believe it conclusively identifies my client as the person who took the watch? Lane's smirk widened. Well, the resolution isn't perfect, but it's clear enough for me. Clear enough? Martin echoed, his tone uncertain. He glanced at Layla as if seeking her guidance, but she simply gave him a barely perceptible nod. The exchange ended without any major revelation, and Martin returned to his seat, deflated. Layla's calm demeanor remained unshaken as she leaned toward him and whispered something inaudible. Whatever she said caused Martin's eyes to widen slightly, but he nodded in agreement. Miss Harris, Judge Bennett said, his tone mockingly patient, I hope you're satisfied with your attorney's valiant effort. If this is the best you can do, I'd start bracing yourself for the inevitable. Layla sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. If by inevitable, you mean the truth coming out, then yes, Your Honor. I'm ready. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, spectators leaning in to exchange hushed speculations. Who was this girl who spoke so fearlessly, even in the face of mounting accusations? The jury, too, seemed conflicted, drawn to her composure but weighed down by the evidence against her. The trial moved to its next phase, with Linda Chavez presenting additional details intended to seal Layla's fate. She highlighted the lack of alibi, the supposed inconsistencies in Layla's initial statements to the police, and the store's pristine reputation. Throughout it all, Layla remained unervingly calm. And then, as Linda was about to conclude her remarks, Layla raised her hand. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting through the room. May I ask a question? Judge Bennett's eyes narrowed. This isn't a classroom, Miss Harris. Sit down and let the adults handle this. Humor me, Layla replied, her tone cool and measured. Just one question. The judge hesitated, his irritation palpable. Finally, he sighed. Fine, let's hear it. Layla turned her gaze to Richard Lane. Mr. Lane, you said you checked the security footage immediately after the watch went missing. Is that correct? Yes, Lane replied, looking mildly annoyed. Why? Layla tilted her head slightly. Were you alone when you reviewed the footage? Or was someone with you? The question seemed innocuous, but a flicker of discomfort crossed Lane's face. I was alone. Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. Interesting. That's all. Judge Bennett's impatience boiled over. Miss Harris, if you're done wasting the court's time, perhaps we can get back to the actual trial? Of course, Your Honor, Layla said, her voice as calm as ever. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. As the session adjourned for the day, the spectators left the courtroom abuzz with speculation. What was Layla's game? Why wasn't she more defensive? And why did it seem like she was the one steering the trial? Whatever the answers, one thing was clear. Layla Harris was not the scared teenager everyone expected her to be. The next day in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as the trial resumed. Judge Bennett entered the room with his usual air of superiority, his gavel coming down with sharp authority. The jury shuffled into their seats, and the murmurs of the spectators quickly died down. Layla Harris, however, sat as she had throughout the trial, calm, composed, and utterly unreadable. Martin Crane, Layla's lawyer, fidgeted nervously as the prosecutor, Linda Chavez, rose to present her final round of evidence. Your Honor, Linda began, we would like to call an expert witness to validate the footage and strengthen our case. This will further demonstrate the defendant's culpability. As Linda spoke, Layla's expression remained serene, but her dark eyes flicked toward the jury, taking in their body language. A subtle smile played at her lips, not one of defiance, but as if she knew a secret no one else did. The expert witness, a middle-aged man with glasses and a conservative suit, took the stand. He introduced himself as a forensic analyst, specializing in security footage. He explained how the video had been reviewed and verified as authentic. The footage from the store's surveillance system has no signs of tampering, he stated confidently. It clearly shows the defendant's actions. Linda turned to the judge, her tone triumphant. Thank you, Your Honor. This further solidifies our argument. Judge Bennett cast a glance at Layla. Miss Harris, anything to say? Or are you still saving your next revelation for the dramatic finale? Layla met his gaze, her calm demeanor unwavering. I think it's important to address all evidence thoroughly, Your Honor. Wouldn't you agree? The judge scowled, but before he could respond, Linda pressed forward, steering the focus back to her case. The prosecution wrapped up their arguments, painting Layla as a calculated thief who had clearly been caught red-handed. When it was finally the defense's turn, Martin Crane stood hesitantly, shuffling his notes. He looked toward Layla for reassurance, and she gave him the same small nod as before. Bolstered, if only slightly, Martin cleared his throat. We contend, Martin began, that the evidence presented by the prosecution is not as conclusive as it appears. The footage, while authenticated, is blurry and far from definitive. Additionally, we must consider the possibility of other explanations for the missing item. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. Other explanations? You mean aside from the one where your client pocketed a $12,000 watch? Martin hesitated, his confidence waning under the judge's cutting tone. But before he could respond, Layla stood. Your Honor, if I may? She interjected. The room stilled. Martin, surprised but not objecting, stepped aside. The spectators leaned forward, sensing that the quiet intensity Layla had carried throughout the trial was about to culminate in something significant. Judge Bennett's expression shifted to one of mild amusement. Oh, this should be good. By all means, Miss Harris, entertain us. Layla stepped into the center of the courtroom, her posture poised and commanding. I'd like to direct the court's attention to a few inconsistencies in the testimony and evidence provided. The room hummed with murmurs, and Judge Bennett banged his gavel for order. Go on, he said, though his tone dripped with skepticism. Layla gestured toward the screen where the paused footage still displayed the grainy image of a figure at the jewelry counter. This footage has been presented as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Yet, it's riddled with uncertainties. For one, the timestamp shows a gap, a glitch, if you will, during the crucial moment when the theft allegedly occurred. Linda Chavez immediately objected. Your Honor, this is speculative at best. The footage has been validated by an expert. But Layla remained undeterred. If the expert is available, I'd like to question him directly. The judge's eyebrow arched. You want to cross-examine the expert witness? Are you sure you're not just prolonging the inevitable? I'm quite sure, Layla said evenly. The expert witness was recalled to the stand, visibly uneasy under the sharp focus of the young defendant. Layla approached him with the confidence of someone far beyond her years. You've authenticated this footage as untampered. Layla began, her tone calm but probing. That's correct, the expert replied. And yet, there is a noticeable gap in the timestamp. Can you account for that? The expert hesitated. It's likely a technical error, common in older surveillance systems. Layla tilted her head slightly. So, you're saying that the footage is not entirely flawless? That there are elements like a gap in the timestamp that could introduce doubt? The expert shifted uncomfortably. I suppose it's possible, but unlikely. Layla turned to the jury. Unlikely, but not impossible. In a case where someone's freedom is at stake, isn't even the slightest doubt significant? The jury members exchanged glances, and even Linda Chavez looked momentarily unsettled. Layla stepped back, her calm demeanor unchanged. Thank you. That's all. As Layla returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The spectators and jury were no longer simply watching a trial. They were waiting to see what Layla would do next. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his smirk now replaced by a scrutinizing stare. Miss Harris, you're certainly full of surprises. But I hope you realize that theatrics won't save you. Layla met his gaze, her expression steady. The truth will save me, Your Honor. And the truth has a way of coming to light. The session ended for the day, leaving the courtroom abuzz with speculation. Who was this young woman who seemed so unshaken, so sure of herself, even in the face of damning accusations. And what truth was she waiting to reveal? The answers felt tantalizingly close, and yet just out of reach. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric when the trial resumed. The spectators leaned forward in anticipation, sensing that Layla Harris had something significant hidden up her sleeve. Judge Roy Bennett settled into his chair, the ever-present smirk on his face thinly masking his irritation. He banged his gavel, calling the room to order. "Miss Harris," he drawled, his voice cutting. "Are we finally going to see where all this bravado leads? Or are you content with wasting everyone's time?" Layla stood, her movements deliberate. Her calm yet commanding presence filled the room as she adjusted the microphone before her. "Your Honor, I appreciate your patience," she said, her voice steady. "And I believe it's time to clarify a few things." Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Oh, this should be good. Enlighten us." Layla looked out toward the jury, her gaze firm but not intimidating. "The prosecution has presented a narrative that paints me as a petty thief. A narrative based on circumstantial evidence, incomplete footage, and the word of a single witness. But I believe the facts tell a very different story." Linda Chavez rose to object, her tone sharp. "Your Honor, this sounds more like a closing argument than a presentation of evidence." Judge Bennett waved her off, though his impatience was evident. "Let's hear what she has to say. This might be entertaining." Layla didn't falter. She reached into a folder on the table and produced several documents, holding them up for the court to see. "These," she said, "are records I obtained through a public request. They include the inventory logs for Lux Jewels over the last 6 months, and they reveal some interesting inconsistencies." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as Layla approached the screen where the grainy surveillance footage had been displayed. She placed the documents under the projector, and the enlarged images appeared on the screen. "As you can see," Layla continued, pointing to the highlighted entries, "there are multiple discrepancies in the store's inventory, particularly concerning high-value items. This isn't the first time an expensive item has gone missing under suspicious circumstances." Richard Lane, the store manager, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. "And it gets more interesting," Layla said, her voice gaining momentum. "One of these missing items, a diamond necklace, is listed as stolen on the very day Mr. Lane happened to request time off unexpectedly. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Judge Bennett leaned forward, his smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Harris?" "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor," Layla replied smoothly. "I'm presenting facts. Facts that suggest a pattern of inconsistencies in Mr. Lane's management practices." Linda Chavez interrupted, her frustration evident. "This is irrelevant, Your Honor. The case is about a stolen watch, not a necklace." Layla turned to Linda, her expression calm but piercing. "Isn't it relevant to question the credibility of the prosecution's key witness? Especially when that witness has a history of unexplained losses and discrepancies in their record-keeping." The jury murmured among themselves, and even Judge Bennett seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Layla turned back to the projector, switching the display to another document. "This," she said, "is a copy of an email I received from an anonymous whistleblower who works at Lux Jewels. In this email, they describe a culture of intimidation and manipulation within the store, specifically citing Mr. Lane's tendency to fabricate incidents to cover his own mistakes." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers, and Judge Bennett banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" Layla's attorney, Martin Crane, looked as though he couldn't believe what was unfolding. He watched in awe as his client methodically dismantled the case against her. "And now," Layla said, her voice rising slightly, "I'd like to present the most critical piece of evidence." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a USB drive, holding it up for the court to see. "This contains audio recordings obtained legally, I might add, that directly implicate Mr. Lane in orchestrating a false accusation against me." The room froze as Layla handed the drive to the bailiff, who plugged it into the courtroom's audio system. Moments later, the recording began to play. In the audio, Richard Lane's voice was unmistakable. "We just need someone to take the fall for this. That girl. She'll be easy to pin it on. No one's going to believe her over me." The courtroom was stunned into silence. Lane's face went pale, and Linda Chavez sat down heavily, her arguments unraveling before her eyes. Judge Bennett stared at Layla, his earlier smugness replaced by something resembling respect, though he masked it with a stern tone. "Miss Harris, how did you obtain this?" Layla's gaze didn't waver. "Let's just say that when you're falsely accused, you learn to defend yourself. And I take defending myself very seriously." The spectators erupted into murmurs once more, and Bennett's gavel struck again. "Order!" As the recording ended, the impact was clear. The prosecution's case had crumbled, and the entire courtroom now looked to Layla not as a defendant, but as someone who had outsmarted the very system meant to condemn her. The courtroom was alive with tension as the evidence Layla Harris presented reverberated through the chamber. The audio recording implicating Richard Lane had shattered the prosecution's case, leaving the spectators, jury, and even Judge Bennett in stunned silence. Lane, seated at the witness stand, looked pale, his composure completely crumbled. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his voice measured but with an edge of disbelief. "Miss Harris, you've made quite the spectacle here today, but this is still my courtroom. Do you have anything else to present? Or are you content with the damage you've already caused?" Layla remained unfazed, meeting the judge's gaze with calm confidence. "Your Honor," she replied, "I have one final point to make if the court will allow me." The judge gestured for her to continue, though his irritation was still palpable. The spectators leaned in, eager to see what Layla had left to reveal. "I've been silent about one key fact," Layla began, her voice steady but resolute. "This court sees me as an 18-year-old girl accused of theft, someone who couldn't possibly know the intricacies of the law or how to defend herself against such serious allegations. But appearances can be deceiving." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as she paused, allowing her words to sink in. Even Linda Chavez sat forward slightly, her earlier frustration replaced by curiosity. Layla turned to the judge, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, I am not just a defendant. I am a licensed attorney." A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Bennett's eyebrows shot up, his typical smugness replaced by genuine shock. "Excuse me? I passed the bar exam at 17, Layla continued, her voice unwavering. "I pursued my legal education independently, dedicating years of study while managing my responsibilities as a high school student. I earned my license last year and have been studying cases like mine ever since." The spectators erupted into whispers, and Judge Bennett's gavel struck repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" Martin Crane, her court-appointed attorney, looked utterly dumbfounded. You're an attorney?" he whispered, barely loud enough for her to hear. Layla nodded. "I am, and I intend to exercise my right to defend myself." Judge Bennett's expression darkened. "Miss Harris, this is highly irregular. Why didn't you disclose this earlier?" "I wanted the system to show its true colors," Layla replied, her tone sharp but controlled. "I wanted this court to see how easily someone like me, a young black woman, is presumed guilty before being given a fair chance to speak. I wanted you to see firsthand the flaws in this case, in this process, and in the assumptions made about me." The judge opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Linda Chavez, meanwhile, stood abruptly, her voice shaking with indignation. "This changes nothing. The evidence still stands, and the court cannot ignore." Layla cut her off, her voice rising with conviction. "The evidence you presented has been dismantled piece by piece. The footage is inconclusive, the store's records are riddled with inconsistencies, and your key witness has been exposed as a liar. What more is there to consider?" The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. It was clear that Layla's words, and her composed yet commanding presence, had left an indelible impression. Judge Bennett sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is unprecedented," he muttered. Miss Harris, as much as I may disagree with your methods, I cannot deny the effectiveness of your arguments. Proceed. Layla nodded, her calm demeanor never wavering. She turned to the jury, addressing them directly. You have the power to decide this case not based on assumptions, but on facts. The prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I committed this crime. And now, it's time to acknowledge that justice doesn't come from a single voice shouting the loudest, but from the truth. The jury leaned in, captivated by her words. The room was silent save for the faint creak of benches as spectators shifted to the edge of their seats. Finally, Judge Bennett cleared his throat, his usual arrogance noticeably absent. Miss Harris, do you rest your case? I do, Your Honor, Layla said, her voice steady. The truth speaks for itself. With that, the judge signaled for closing arguments, but the mood in the room had already shifted irrevocably. Layla had not only defended herself, she had turned the trial into a stage for exposing the biases and flaws in the very system meant to deliver justice. As the session ended, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Spectators and reporters alike speculated on what would come next, but one thing was certain. Layla Harris had changed the narrative. The final day of the trial was nothing short of extraordinary. The courtroom was packed. Spectators, reporters, and even a few local officials had gathered to witness the outcome of what had become one of the most talked about cases in Austin's recent history. Layla Harris sat at the defense table, her composure as unshakable as ever. Judge Bennett entered the room, his usual arrogance tempered by the events of the previous day. His gavel struck, and the room fell silent. Let's get to it, he said curtly, his tone clipped. The jury has reached a verdict, and I'd like to hear it without any more dramatics. Layla's attorney, Martin Crane, looked as though he were holding his breath. But Layla? She was the picture of calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze fixed on the jury foreman as he stood to deliver their decision. In the matter of the state of Texas versus Layla Harris, the foreman began, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then the courtroom exploded into murmurs and gasps. Spectators whispered to one another. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and Martin exhaled in relief, his shoulders sagging. Layla, however, didn't react immediately. She sat still, her face betraying none of the emotions roiling within her. When she finally stood, it was with the quiet dignity that had defined her throughout the trial. She turned to the jury, offering them a small nod of gratitude. Judge Bennett banged his gavel again. Order! Order in the court! Once the noise subsided, he fixed his gaze on Layla. Miss Harris, no, Attorney Harris, he said, his voice tinged with grudging respect. You've done something here today that few could have anticipated. You've used your intelligence and your knowledge of the law to dismantle a case that, frankly, looked airtight. I'll admit I underestimated you. That won't happen again. Layla met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. Thank you, Your Honor. I hope this serves as a reminder that assumptions are dangerous, especially in a system meant to deliver justice. As the judge dismissed the court, the room erupted into applause, a rare and almost surreal moment in such a setting. Reporters clamored to get closer to Layla, shouting questions and flashing cameras as she made her way toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, as if in celebration of her victory. Layla stood at the top of the courthouse steps, facing the swarm of reporters and onlookers who had gathered. She raised her hand, signaling for silence. Today wasn't just about proving my innocence, she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that too often judges people based on appearances rather than facts. It was about showing that knowledge and determination can triumph over prejudice and assumptions. And it was about reminding all of us that justice is something we must fight for. The crowd erupted into applause once more, and Layla stepped back, allowing the moment to pass. She turned and walked down the courthouse steps, her head held high. Later that evening, as the courthouse emptied and the city moved on to its next story, Layla sat alone in her modest apartment, the events of the past weeks finally catching up with her. She thought about the accusations, the doubts, and the relentless efforts to discredit her. But she also thought about the jury's decision, the truth she had brought to light, and the lives she might have inspired by standing her ground. A small smile touched her lips as she opened her laptop to continue her work. The fight wasn't over, it never was. But Layla Harris was ready for whatever came next. This concludes Layla's story, an inspiring tale of resilience, intelligence, and the pursuit of justice. Let me know if you'd like to explore anything further or just any part of the narrative. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.